All right, so let's get started. I'll introduce each one and say a little about it. Brent Ranalli has presented before, and thorough knowledge. We had a great time last time. We got Thomas Paine, so now we're going on to Thoreau. I'm going to reveal, you may have a reveal here about you and Thoreau. Brent Ranalli has reenacted Thoreau, like dressed up, done the stuff. So he has been Thoreau, okay? And quite honestly, I don't know if we've had this level of engagement with the figure-rights. It's going to be excellent. As each one goes up, I'll say a little bit, but I'll let you get started.
Well, thanks. Carl was telling me last night that I should have delivered this presentation as Thoreau. I didn't bring my outfit. But
We are furious.
Fair enough. All right, so if you know something about Henry David Thoreau, you probably know that he was an American philosopher who lived in Concord, Massachusetts in the mid-19th century, where he was associated with Ralph Waldo Emerson and the Transcendentalist movement. And that he's most famous for two things. For his book Walden, which tells the story of the experiment he made in simple living and communion with nature on the shores of Walden Pond. And for the essay Civil Disobedience, that tells of the evening he spent in jail for, the night he spent in jail for non-payment of taxes, which has inspired generations of social movements. In this talk, I'll be exploring what Thoreau would have to say about basic income and articulating a Thoreauvian basic income variant. So I want to start out by clearing away a couple of misconceptions that might make the casual reader of Thoreau think that he would be totally opposed to basic income. So the first misconception is that Thoreau's experiment at Walden Pond was about living self-sufficiently. You might have heard Thoreau criticized for dining out with the Emersons while he was living at the pond and for accepting pies from his mother and sister. That would have been hypocrisy if Thoreau's goal had been self-sufficiency in the cabin by the pond. And if Thoreau's philosophy was a philosophy of doing everything for yourself and accepting help from no one, there would be no room for anything like basic income in his program. But self-sufficiency was not the goal. The kind of independence and self-reliance that Thoreau was trying to demonstrate and illustrate was moral self-reliance, first and foremost. His philosophy was about following your own path in life, stepping to the music that you hear, rather than mindlessly conforming or striving to meet other people's expectations. The second misconception is that Thoreau was anti-government. Libertarians have some favorite Thoreau quotations, but Thoreau was not a libertarian in the modern sense. He was not anti-government. When he famously refused to pay his poll tax and spent a night in jail, that was not a protest against taxes as such. It was a protest against his tax dollars going to support an evil institution, Southern slavery. In his essay on civil disobedience, he wrote that he gladly pays other taxes, and he thinks that there are plenty of valuable things government should be doing and spending money on, starting with education. So next, I'd like to look at Thoreau's views on poverty, since the problem of poverty is a typical starting point for basic income advocacy. Thoreau's most famous or notorious statement on poverty is a passage in Walden where he criticizes a poor Irish family in the neighborhood for splurging on things like meat and coffee while they live in squalor. He also writes about other former inhabitants of the Walden Pond district over the years and concludes that what held them back from forming a thriving community more than anything else was the vice, intemperance, alcohol. Thoreau does not counsel against providing material aid to the poor, and he did contribute from his own resources, but he is not very sanguine about the good it does. His view is that aid on the moral plane is superior to material aid. Be sure that you give the poor the aid they most need, he says, though it be your example, which leaves them far behind. Thoreau's view is that of what we might call a compassionate conservative today, in today's terminology. In this view, poverty is not so much a lack of income as a social and cultural problem that requires an intervention of some kind. And on this view, a basic income is unlikely to be more effective against poverty than any other type of purely financial assistance. So now let's get right to the heart of Thoreau's philosophy. Many readers of Walden are initially attracted to Thoreau for what he has to say about simple living. But simple living, and even the moral self-reliance that I mentioned earlier, are not the ultimate goal. What all of these things are good for is catching even larger game, which which is genius. As a transcendentalist, Thoreau believed that the individual is the measure of all things, and the highest calling of the individual is self-exploration and self-improvement. I would have the flower and fruit of a man, he writes, not just the stem and leaves. Let everyone mind his own business and endeavor to be what he was made. This could mean developing a talent, or finding and pursuing a calling, or accomplishing a feat. And it could also mean inner work, cultivating character. And Thoreau would probably say that the inner and outer work go together. Every person has great potential waiting to be tapped. This is genius. And a person who achieves superlatives by tapping into genius is unique and yet also representative, to use Emerson's phrase, of human potentiality. In some cases, pursuit of genius will lead a person directly into a profession that is remunerative. In other cases, it will lead in directions that are not remunerative. Thoreau's own calling was as a naturalist and a writer. He describes himself in Walden as the self-appointed inspector of snowstorms and rainstorms, a surveyor of forest paths and all across-lot routes. And for a long time, I was a reporter to a journal of no very wide circulation, that is, his own private journal, which was the source of his lectures and essays. And he goes on, with wry humor, to express some surprise that his townsmen did not reward him for sauntering and botanizing and keeping a journal. It became more and more evident that my townsmen would not, after all, admit me into the list of town officers, nor make my place a sinecure with a moderate allowance. So, finding that my fellow citizens were not likely to offer me any room in the courthouse, or a curacy, or living anywhere else, he repaired to the woods, where he could live cheaply and pursue his calling without the town's financial support. Thoreau is offering here an argument, or a presumption, that his scientific and creative endeavors are worthy of public support. And even if this is tongue-in-cheek, he backs it up with further arguments. The town already allocates money for subsidies in the form of aid to the poor. Why shouldn't philanthropy help us in our best state, he asks, when we are most worthy to be helped? So Thoreau is offering the gem of a policy idea here, the idea that genius or talent could and should be subsidized. And we can take this idea and flesh it out. We might call the subsidy a genius grant. And since it is an axiom of transcendentalism that every individual has a talent or a calling to pursue, the genius grant would not just be for a chosen few, but would be a democratic subsidy that everyone would in principle be eligible for. As with any conversation about basic income, the question will be asked about genius grants: can we afford it? Thoreau's response is in the chapter of Walden entitled Reading, where he talks about spending on education and culture by the town of Concord. And I won't read the whole quote out loud, but in essence he's saying, of course we can afford to spend on education and culture, and if we had genius grants, they would certainly come under that heading. We just need to make them a priority in our public budgets. So at this point, we can sum up what Thoreau's philosophy would require in a genius grant program, in some ways in which it differs from a typical basic income scheme. So first, the justification would not be poverty reduction, but development of human potential. Second, the genius grant could take the form of cash, but that's not a strict requirement. What's important is that it be material support that enables someone wishing to explore and pursue a vocation to do so. There's no minimum quantity, but a full genius grant might be considered the amount necessary to sustain an individual who's willing to live very modestly. And participation would be voluntary, but in the spirit of the transcendentalist axiom, the opportunity should be available to all. Now, to flesh things out a little more, let's look at some of Thoreau's ideas about technology and work and leisure. Thoreau has something of a reputation as a Luddite. He is the philosopher who would rather walk than take the rail, and who derides the magnetic telegraph by doubting that Maine and Texas, once connected, will have anything worth saying to each other. But there is another side to Thoreau. He was fascinated by machines and was an inventor himself. On his travels, he stopped to tour factories and take notes. And he did make use of the railroad when it suited him. For Thoreau, what's great about technology is that it has made it easier to satisfy our animal needs and save a little time for the fine arts, to use his words. The efficiencies of technology are the source of the collective wealth and leisure that can make genius grants possible and finance them. But Thoreau understood that something has gone wrong. Men have become the tools of their tools. We do not ride the railroad, it rides us. We have made a fetish out of efficiency, and we pursue efficiency for its own sake rather than treating it as a means of obtaining leisure for higher goals. So when it comes to leisure, he writes that the laboring man has not leisure for a true integrity day by day. He has no time to be anything but a machine. The solution would be to provide the worker with more leisure, leisure that technological progress and the worker's own increased productivity would amply allow. And with apologies on Thoreau's behalf here for that he's not using language that's gender neutral, we should feed and clothe him gratuitously sometimes and recruit him with our cordials before we judge of him. The finest qualities of our nature, like the bloom of fruits, can be preserved only by the most delicate handling. Yet we do not treat ourselves nor one another thus tenderly. To feed and clothe him gratuitously sometimes is to make the worker, any worker, every man and every woman, the occasional recipient of a Thoreauvian genius grant. Seen from this perspective, the genius grant is not, like a standard basic income, essentially a grant of money or a guarantee of a standard of living. It is a grant of leisure, for leisure is what we need in order to cultivate our finest qualities. In 1843, Thoreau wrote a review of a book called The Paradise Within the Reach of All Men by one J.A. Etzler. Etzler predicted that mankind would soon be living in a technological utopia powered by sun, wind, and wave, a sort of steampunk world without the steam, maybe tide punk or wind punk. He predicted terraforming and high-speed transport and cruise ships, or floating islands as he described them. Once the powers of nature are harnessed, he wrote, people will enjoy perfect leisure. Everything desirable for human life may be had by every man in superabundance, without labor and without pay. Any amenity or delicacy may be called up instantly by a short turn of some crank. Thoreau had some positive things to say about the book, but ultimately he did not endorse Etzler's scheme, and that is because for Etzler, leisure is an end in itself. For Etzler, leisure is well-being. For Thoreau, leisure is a starting point, a means to other ends, an opportunity to engage in the real work of self-cultivation. So this points to a final requirement for the Thoreauvian genius grant. The leisure it provides must be not ordinary leisure, but leisure consecrated to a higher purpose. Thus, a mere shorter work week, for example, a typical proposal to share the benefits of increased productivity, will not do. The program should be set up in a way that involves self-reflection, perhaps with formal self-reporting of goals and progress toward them. I've got one last slide here. 2 minutes, perfect. One last final point is that today's basic income debate is driven in large part by concern that technological advance, automation, will eliminate jobs. Basic income is seen as a sensible adaptation to an emerging world without work. But if we take our cue from Thoreau, we might say that basic income advocates are worried about exactly the wrong danger. That what we should really be worried about is that automation will trap people in unnecessary work. The trouble with the conventional argument that technology will cut the demand for human labor is that we've heard it before many times, and it has not come to pass. The same argument was made during the guaranteed income debates of the 1960s and 1970s, and earlier as well, as far back as Etzler. At a distance of nearly 200 years, Etzler holds up our own world to us in a funhouse mirror. The technological marvels have come to pass. Even the ability to have any article of commerce delivered to our doorstep with a virtual turn of the crank. Hey Alexa. But the anticipated leisure is nowhere to be found. When technology liberated us from toiling in the fields, we migrated to factories. As technology and trade have liberated us from manufacturing, we have invented entire industries in the service sector to absorb that surplus labor. Thoreau tells the story of seeing a teamster carting a heavy load past his window early one morning, seemingly putting all the neighborhood to shame by being so industrious, such a productive member of society. But it turned out that the man had merely been toting an ornamental rock to adorn a rich man's yard. Thoreau thinks one should be ashamed of engaging in such trivial and unedifying work. Most men would feel insulted if it were proposed to employ them in throwing stones over a wall and then throwing them back merely that they might earn their wages. but many are no more worthily employed now. So Thoreau might say that even if self-driving cars and robotic retail distribution centers and massive online lecture courses are unprecedentedly disruptive in the coming years in terms of jobs lost, history warns us not to underestimate the ingenuity of society in willfully inventing new forms of work, what anthropologist David Graeber calls bullshit jobs, to fill the breach. The real task, now as in Thoreau's own day, might not be to reconcile ourselves to involuntary unemployment, but rather it may be to rescue ourselves from unnecessary employment.
We'll do questions after the whole panel's presented. Keiko Sono works with the Forge Collective. She's an artist. The Flow of Gift, Universal Basic Income, and the Creative Community.
Well, I could not have followed a better presentation than mine. Sorry. Talking about art is hard. It's often portrayed as ostentatious or pretentious in numerous TV programs and movies. But it's surprisingly accessible to those who who experience it firsthand, especially if they're not in the typical white cube of high-end galleries, and it might change one's life. Why am I talking about this? Because this transformative power of art might hold a clue to building a system that would ensure that UBI's positive effect is maximized after its implementation. And it might even help us avoid the catastrophic breakdown of civil society. The quality we seek in art is elusive. It's not easily measurable, and it's not constant or consistent. Sometimes we're impressed by the sheer mastery of a skill. Sometimes we're taken aback by stripped simplicity of a fresh new way of seeing a familiar object. What is constant, however, is that when we are moved by a work of art, or music, or poetry, or a film, we feel grateful. We feel that this experience is a gift, not something that's acquired, even if it was purchased. This is the realm of gift economy, as author and poet Louis Hyde elucidates in his classic masterpiece, The Gift. What complicates things, though, is that art exists in dual economies, that of the market and gift economy, or they can be also referred to as abundance-based or scarcity-based economies. Because we know the value of art by heart, its commodification is also a huge business. So let's look at the numbers. So there is no doubt that people value art. I mean, just look at those numbers. These are auction figures, but the figure of the first sale art is comparable, or it's probably even worse than this, meaning that a very, very small percentage of all artists get a really large portion of all the profits. It is quite breathtaking to reflect how art begins at the extreme end of abundance and ends at the extreme end of scarcity. But the secretive world of high-priced art is just a tiny fraction of the entire industry. According to the study published by the US Bureau of Economic Analysis and the National Endowment of the Arts last year, the arts contribute $763.66 billion to the US economy, 4 times more than the agricultural sector, and $200 billion more than transportation or warehousing. The arts employ 4.9 million workers across the country with earnings of more than $370 billion. Furthermore, the arts exported $20 billion more than imported, providing a positive trade balance. So this looks great, right? The art industry is booming. Artists must be doing great. But this is not what I see around me, including myself. So I set out to do a survey to explore how artists are actually living and creating. So this survey was distributed through social media and arts organizations around the country and received 118 responses. I'm happy to inform you that there is a great interest in that sector on UBI. In this question of how they rank art in life, 83% of respondents valued art as at least as important as other most significant aspects of their lives, such as family. But roughly the same percentage of people are not making a living from art. Think about this for a while. The same number of people who say art is life are not able to survive making art. Similarly, 82% are not spending as much time on their creative activities as they wish. So what's the obstacle? Surprise, insufficient cash. So how does this make sense in an industry of $763 billion? Would UBI help them spend more time on art? Of course. But is it enough to unleash their creative potential? Let's look at a note that I received from one of the respondents. This is a very complex matter. I experienced paid residency as a problem rather than a chance. I do not believe that UBI is possible if society does not set themselves universal goals to prosper together and survive together rather than against each other. This is a really interesting point. These are matters beyond money and survival. So let's go deeper. In this question, people who generate income from creative work were asked about how they felt about it. Only 31% of them said their work aligns with their passion. 43% responded that their projects feel like jobs, and 13% said their paid projects are killing their creativity. And another 13% expressed a range of neutral to negative effects. So artists seem to be in a bind. Although we need more income to create, when we create income from art, it tends to lose the magical power of the gift. Many artists say they'd rather give away their work as gifts than selling it for a purchasable price in order to survive. This is because this magical power of gift or abundance is more valuable than the money. Let's see just how much artists tolerate the survival mode to create. Here's another note from a respondent. We are both artists and work at home. We are incredibly lucky to make a living doing what we love. However, we're also constantly stressed about bills and often behind on regular payments and dealing with debt we can't take care of. In addition to my own work as a writer and performer, I started a nonprofit arts organization which now employs me. I produce, curate, host, perform, and present the work of many people. I am constantly in fundraising mode, and it's exhausting. This is becoming a common path for artists, myself included. A natural extension of creating and sharing your work is to help other artists share their work. So many of us become curators, event organizers, nonprofit founders, creating even more work for little money. So let's go back to the data with these stories in mind. Remember, the arts employ 4.9 million workers across the country with earnings of more than $370 billion. Where does that money go? Last month, Garner Arts Center in Lower Midhudson hosted Lab Fest, a celebration of beer and art. They saw upward of 10,000 visitors in 2 days, each paying $50 to enter, which included viewing of installation and performance by 60 artists. Art was an indispensable attractant to this festival. This is one such art installation by Neil Hollinger, my dear friend. He creates colorful, fun, and surreal space with found objects, installation foam, and paint. Look at these details. He creates these in his small basement studio. He sells very few of them. He just creates and creates and creates, and they're in his studio. For all his work for this particular festival, he got paid $100, which barely covered his gas for 4 trips. To be fair, festivals like this are expensive, and most revenue goes to liability insurance, operational, and administrative costs. But the truth is, most organizations don't include artists' fees in the budget to begin with, except for maybe just a few $100 stipends, if at all. His work is as good as any hyper-successful artist. He even tried working with a New York City gallery. But it's just not his world. In fact, the high-end art world is not for most artists. As I mentioned before, it's at the extreme end of the scarcity-based system. Many artists find the scene too toxic for their creativity and well-being. For him, art is not a choice. He's like a shark. If he's not making art, he would die. He is the embodiment of my favorite quote from artist Tom Sachs: "The reward for good work is more work." And like most artists, creation of work is not complete until it is shared. That's why we even go into debt to show our work. It's okay when you're young, but it weighs on you as you get older. Here's another note from a respondent. Most, at least many creatives, suffer from some form of depression, which I think is directly related to living in a world that does not support them. The self-expression is vital to the creative well-being. So we have no choice. We're artists, we create. We have no choice, we can't quit. This is a dream come true for market economy, isn't it? Where profit is everything. What's better than workers who are willing to work with or without pay? People see it as acceptable to exploit those who are passionate about what they do. This is the finding that that came out in a new study entitled "Understanding Contemporary Forms of Exploitation, Attributes of Passion Serve to Legitimize the Poor Treatment of Workers" by Duke University. Sandwiched between the extreme scarcity-based model and the public acceptance that it's okay to exploit the passion-based workers, the creatives are screwed. Not only the creatives, but the society as a whole lose out because we are being deprived of a huge growth and productive potential by not tapping into the massive pool of talents and labor. If we have this big portion of GDP coming from the arts in our present scarcity-based system, imagine what we could achieve in an abundance-based system and what this could do to the world. So what would a world that aligns with our passion and the natural way creatives work look like? To find out, let's look at another example. This is a piece called Salvage, created by another friend of mine, Michael Asbill. For this piece, he visited the highway department's dump site for roadkill carcasses several times and collected bleached bones. As he picked, he carefully numbered each bone and stored them in boxes. Then he put them all together. It took a very long time. This work is magical, It's not just how you feel in its presence, but knowing the entire process. It's a living poetry. It's something you have to experience directly, an increasingly rare requirement in our digital world. You feel grateful that this artist existed and that he made this work for himself, for you, and for the world. It's priceless. And yet, he sees no money whatsoever. What motivates artists to go to this extreme? Do they feel that they sacrifice something in their life for art? 86% of respondents they say they do. So if they feel that they sacrifice something, what made up for that sacrifice? More than 50% of people cited joy of making, connection to the natural world, history or something larger than life, satisfaction of problem solving, a sense of making a difference, and meeting interesting people as the rewards. These are indeed valuable. In fact, what is life without these elements? Don't get me wrong, we need money. We need to feel secure in order to activate abundance. But once the floor is secured, what we seek is artistic and intellectual satisfaction, a sense of purpose, and a community. A system that can offer these rewards will ensure that the benefit of guaranteed income would be maximized by activating powerful intrinsic motivation. I have some ideas and examples for such systems, but that's a topic for another conversation.
You've got one more.
Okay,
I'm
yeah,
sorry.
about half of the respondents say they would do more community work if they received UBI. There is an incredible amount of abundance in the arts, but artists don't exist without an audience. The audience appreciate the arts because they too are endowed with the ability to receive the gift of abundance. This is why figuring out a way artists could activate their abundance would help UBI to achieve what it's intended to do, to shift our mindset from artificial scarcity to abundance of well-being on the societal level. And this is vital in our survival as a civil society as we head into the downward spiral of actual scarcity caused by the climate breakdown. Because survival will not be enough to save us. In order to survive, we need to thrive. Follow the arts. Thank you.
Thank you, Keiko. Sono. Elliot Rossiter is a philosopher, teaches at Douglas College. He and I were talking, we both teach a lot of applied ethics. The presentation's capabilities, narratives, and the free writing objection.
Okay, thank you very much. Those are two lovely papers. It's a privilege to follow this. Hope to continue on the discussion in some capacity. So I am. This paper is largely about the political function of narrative in the arts, and I'm not an artist. I mean, I wrote some angsty poetry as a teenager, but that should never see the light of day. So I'm a philosopher, so I'll very much be approaching this as a philosopher, but I welcome any feedback. So I think, so I'm interested in thinking about this question of how to understand objections to basic income and how to make a persuasive case of the good or the value of basic income. And so I think one thing to recognize is first sort of the order of persuasion. So I very much like a lot of what Blaise Pascal has to say. This is the French philosopher of the 17th century about persuasion. And his basic idea is that in order to really persuade somebody to do something or believe something, you have to first make them wish that it were true. You have to make them love it. You have to make them want it to be the case, and then you show them how it's the case. So I mean, this is kind of talking about how to set up a religious apologetic, but really I think the basic principle kind of applies more broadly. So I think it's really important in terms of how can we use narrative in a way that makes people wish that basic income were the case. And then there's all sorts of great research and arguments for how it could be practically implemented. But I think this first step is really important. So what I want to do is kind of provide a conceptual model for thinking about that. So I think the first thing to recognize is that a lot of beliefs, including objections and mistaken beliefs about basic income, aren't just purely rational in nature, but rather have a kind of deep emotional dimension as well. So for instance, one example is that I think a lot of negative issues or negative approaches in politics aren't just a failure of reason, but really a kind of misplaced empathy, where I might have empathy for sort of one group, one person, but fail to have empathy in a way. So the problem isn't so much a lack of emotion, but rather that my emotion just isn't oriented in the right way. And so I think to respond to this, there's a tradition that's really emerges out of ancient Greece in terms of Hellenistic philosophy, but the philosopher Martha Nussbaum has talked a lot about this, about the importance of therapeutic arguments. So there's when she discusses this, she cites the philosopher Epicurus, and Epicurus says, empty is that philosopher's argument, or I might say, empty is that intellectual's argument which does nothing to relieve suffering of the soul. So this idea that when we're presenting a case, it's important to address both reason and emotion. And so therapeutic arguments then recognize that really we have to engage in a kind of therapy to our listeners, to our audience, in recognizing both the place of both mistaken reason and emotion. And I think that narrative has an excellent capacity for addressing both our reason and our emotion. So getting us into a state of reflective empathy. If I had more time, it would be interesting to think about some of the bases for that in cognitive psychology, in terms of how when we process stories in a different way. So there's some research in terms of how mirror neurons, how we kind of, when we sort of look at an image or we read a first-person account of something, we process that information differently. We sort of put ourselves in that story in a way that's different than when we kind of process statistics. That's sort of another dimension of the brain. I'm not a cognitive psychologist. I'm just a philosopher who dabbles in it, so it's going to be dangerous if I say too many more things that are imprecise. But I think it's really interesting to think about how narrative kind of gets us to process information differently. So one of the, perhaps maybe the chief ethical objection to basic income is this free riding objection that occurs in different forms. You hear it in terms of, well, people are just going to be lazy, people aren't going to make a contribution, people are going to stop working, why should I support money? Why should I support giving money or my tax dollars going to people who are just going to do nothing with it, who are just going to be a drag? And so this seems to be, to me, one of the chief kind of barriers to get over here. And I think there's stigmatizing narratives that have contributed to this. I'll talk about that in a moment. I think something important to recognize here is that a lot of this free riding objection turns on our sense of reciprocity, that there's a violation of reciprocity. When someone receives some kind of economic benefit from society, but makes no contribution in return. I think that's kind of the basic objection, and I think that's generally a mistaken objection. But this kind of sense of, there's some kind of responses to this that try to do away with reciprocity and say, let's defend basic income, let's forget about kind of talking about reciprocity. But I think that's kind of mistaken. I think that this sense of reciprocity is quite deep in our nature. So there's an economist, Samuel Bowles, who does a lot of work on understanding game theory. And so the basic idea within a game theory model is that we're motivated by self-interest, rational self-interest. That's how, it predicts, you should always screw over someone. That's always the dominant strategy to take in all of these games. But he's done a lot of research on these games and shows that's not actually really how people behave. People will often act against their self-interest if they perceive that there's some kind of failure of reciprocity. And so he argues that we need to replace this idea of human beings as kind of homo economicus, that we are rational self-interested beings with this idea of homo reciprocans, right? That we are kind of, reciprocity is kind of built into our nature. It's sort of a deep kind of instinct, deep kind of view that we have of things. So I think it's important to try to address this sense of reciprocity. Okay, I've already described what free riding is. Now, there is a kind of inconsistency in here, and lots of people, some people have talked about this and have made very good contributions to this, that there's a kind of, we tend to really care a lot more, or in public discussions, about the idle poor rather than the idle rich. So we're not worried about, people who receive, like the Waltons family. We're not really worried about what these people are doing with their money, if they're idle, or people who win the lottery. We don't really tend to care about idleness in that way, but it seems to be focused kind of on the poor, and largely that's a kind of emerges from a stigmatizing narrative of seeing those who are poor as having failed in some sort of way. So there's a kind of pathologizing narrative that occurs here. And I think the right response to that is to try to set up a counter-narrative. How do we kind of create a narrative that responds to that objection through stories, through art? So I think that, my basic kind of view on how to overcome this reciprocity objection is to recognize that making a contribution to society is much broader than being willing to engage in paid work. That there are all sorts of different ways that people can make a productive contribution to their communities that's beyond paid work. The approach that I take is to say that someone satisfies reciprocity or someone makes a contribution to their community if they promote the capabilities of others around them. That's what it counts to make as a contribution. Okay, so let me just talk a bit about what capabilities are, and then I'll go to talking about narrative. How much time do I have, just out of curiosity?
You've got 7 minutes.
7 minutes? Okay.
I'll give you one if you need.
Sure, okay, so 7 to 20. Okay, so this is something we're familiar with the last slide in terms of pilot projects showing that basic income increases pro-social tendencies. I think that the capability approach model that I'm going to briefly describe in a moment here is a useful way of thinking about a more precise way of thinking what it means to engage in pro-social behavior. So a lot of what I'm saying is not critical at all of any of the work that's being done on basic income, but just kind of providing a way of thinking about it with different kind of conceptual foundations. So what is a capability? So a lot of this work has been developed by Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum. Some people in the room are probably familiar with this work. But their basic definition of a capability is an opportunity. So that I have the opportunity to choose or to act in some sphere of importance to human life. And then the sort of term that corresponds to this is what's called a functioning. So when I exercise a capability in some way, that's a functioning. So for instance, a capability, so Nussbaum gives a set of central capabilities. So for instance, we might think of, to access education is a capability, and then when I actually, choose a school, go to that school and complete a degree, that would be the functioning. Or to have access to healthcare would be the capability. The functioning would be sort of using a specific kind of procedure. And they have reasons why they want to talk about capabilities rather than functioning, but that's kind of going to move us too far right now. So here's kind of a set of capabilities. So sort of life, being alive, capabilities associated with life, bodily health, bodily integrity, freedom, autonomy over one's body, the opportunity to use one's senses, imagination, and thought. So I think the opportunity to engage in art, for instance, would be a really important capability for Nussbaum. Emotions, practical reason, affiliation, that I can affiliate with different sorts of groups, my relationship with other species, the opportunity to play, basic control over one's political or physical environment. And so what I want to say is that the social product and what it means to contribute to the social product is something more than just GDP. So a lot of the capability approach comes out of a criticism of GDP, saying, look, this is a really simplistic kind of metric that often can obscure or miss deep problems. So we have different kind of indices that come out of the capability approach, the Human Development Index, which looks at things like life expectancy, health outcomes, educational outcomes. And they can also be tweaked as well to include things like gender equality, other sorts of things that really we think can be meaningful barriers to exercising capabilities, but that aren't really fully captured within just a GDP or are often obscured within a GDP or GNP kind of model. So I conceive of the social product then within capabilities as broader than just GDP, but rather the product is the sort of set of capabilities, the set of these opportunities that are produced within a society. So to make a contribution then to my community isn't just to earn a wage in a way that can be measured and to engage in some sort of GDP measurable activity, but rather this broader set of capabilities. So at any point that I engage in an activity that promotes these things for myself and others, I'm contributing to my community. And so I think, there's a lot of good evidence that shows that people who receive basic income tend to do this more, tend to increase the capabilities of others more. And so in that way, they satisfy this reciprocity objection. So I think getting people to recognize that, though, I think it's misguided to just try to make that rational argument. I mean, it's important to do, but I think in terms of really being persuasive, narrative is important. So showing stories, telling stories, using art to illustrate the ways in which basic income recipients promote the capabilities of others within their community. And I think there's good evidence that narrative has the capacity to expand our circle of concern, and getting us in thinking about who we have empathy for, and then kind of correcting some of the mistakes in our empathy and getting us to reflect. I won't talk about tragedy, but that's because I think I'm running out of time here. So a lot of the objection, this reciprocity objection, turns on a stigmatizing narrative, which really should be redressed through empowering narratives. So for instance, the humans of basic income are the sort of display down there, I think is a great example of this empowering narrative that can be used to redress these stigmatizing narratives. Okay. So, I mean, we're all probably aware of an example. A common stigmatizing narrative is this idea of sort of a welfare queen that kind of contributed quite a lot to kind of a pathologization of poverty and emphasis that, look, there's a kind of moral defect of poverty in terms of personal responsibility that then structures the way in which we think certain policies should be delivered and certain aid policies. But really stigmatizing narratives function, I think, in my mind, as a kind of propaganda. What makes propaganda propaganda is that it has this concealing character to it. It's art, it's narrative that's used, but it conceals. It conceals the true nature of human beings and social realities to us. So when we sort of look at Linda Taylor as an example, and this is the New York Times, kind of one of the first articles represented by her, but generally this whole idea of a welfare queen kind of conceals the true nature of human beings to us. It conceals the complexities that are in every situation. It makes us think in terms of simplistic ways, and it also makes us fail to recognize the ways in which our environment or our communities play a role in shaping the kinds of possibilities and decisions that are open to us. So yeah, in contrast to these stigmatizing narratives, empowering narratives, by contrast, reveal to us the true nature of people and realities. And so people are able to express a sense of agency in this. I think one really deep aspect of injustice is when you have stories told about you over which you have no control. So an empowering narrative is to sort of redress that injustice. And so narrative justice then is to allow people some agency in having their stories told. Okay, and so I think capability is a good model for looking at this, because capabilities are always going to express themselves in specific contexts that lend themselves, thank you, to narrative presentation. And that basic income should be defended this way with stories or with art, showing the ways in which recipients engage in capability promoting activities. And again, I just want to point to, I was thinking of different sorts of examples, but really the Humans of Basic Income photography exhibit down there is a great example of this. So I think I'll leave it there. So thank you.
Richard Keefer. Richard Keefer is drawing from experiences in the education system in Rochester, New York. Paper's Basic Income Educational Report.
So I feel kind of like, was it Admiral Stockton? He was Ross Perot's vice president. Who am I and why the hell am I here? Anyway, so my interest in basic income has come from my experience working as a substitute teacher in the Rochester City School Districts for the past 7 years. And in many ways, it's kind of like operating a certain sort of netherworld where I am filling a role where I am a teacher and yet I am not a teacher. And so I almost feel like I'm wrestling with the problems of education in an urban setting. I don't know if I mentioned that I met at the Rossiter City School District. So it's one of the poorest school districts in the country. We have a terrible problem with concentrated poverty. And as a consequence, it seems that we have just an amazing amount of dysfunction in terms of maintaining a school superintendent. I think we've had, probably 7 over the past 10 years. And so we constantly seem to be having these crises where everybody's like, this educational system cannot continue, and then we supposedly do something about it, and then we proceed to have the same crisis a couple years later. So in any event, my basic thesis after watching what's been going on in our within the urban setting is that until we actually deal with poverty, that the process that we go through in terms of educational reform is really just rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. It is not going to have the effect that we hope for it. Now Rochester, it's funny because growing up we used to always pick on Buffalo because Buffalo was worse than we were, I guess, because they were the blue collar town and you really saw deindustrialization happen in Buffalo. And it's funny that sort of projection makes you feel better, and I have always grown up with the feeling that Rochester in some way was different because our technology was a little higher end than steel, right? We were the city of Kodak, we were the city of Xerox, we were the city of Bausch and Lomb, and so in some ways that we were able to kind of not experience the kind of degradation that had happened in other Rust Belt cities. But the point of fact is I was getting ready to come down here, I took a look at the manufacturing demographics, and in 1970 we had over 100,000 people involved in manufacturing, and today it is less, much less than 10,000. Probably less than, yeah, somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 people. So that it's just basically a ski slope down over the past 50 years of deindustrialization. And at the same time, in 1970, the rates of poverty in the Rochester City School District were about 12%. And today it is over 90%. So the problem there is this increased poverty is that we just keep concentrating the poorest members of our society in the Rochester City School District, and you're seeing a kind of white flight definitely existed at one point. Obviously, the district was predominantly it was majority white, and then as the 70s moved into the 80s, it switched. And at this point today, the district is it's basically about 60% African American, about 20 to 25% Hispanic, and a smaller percentage of white folks and a small percentage of Asians, generally refugees. And so, needless to say, the educational outcomes that we are achieving in the Rochester City School District are abysmal. We have graduation rates around, I want to say, probably about total in the maybe 70%. And the problem with that number is even that number itself is a perfect example of Campbell's Law, which is that if the more that you measure something as an indication of progress about any kind of social phenomenon and then tie a kind of high pressure situation, is that you end up losing, that particular measurement loses any value. So what we do to push those numbers up is that we will take students who have not been able to do well, and we'll maybe decide in their 12th plus year of high school that they are learning disabled. And then we can get a lower pass rate on their culminating exams and then graduate them. So the problem is actually worse than it appears. In light of all that's been going on in this district, what has happened is that we've started, we've been dealing with the same suggestions for how you should improve educational outcomes. So there are basically a few things. The first one is institutional transformation, right? The problem is that our school board is messed up. And that what we need to do is get some institutional improvement. And this would be the kind of typical carrots and sticks. Okay, so it's very kind of typical neoliberal philosophy of you need to incentivize people. And once you incentivize people, tell them what you want to see, reward them for that, they will go ahead and they'll make that happen. And the problem with that is that in this particular case, it hasn't worked out that way. Despite the carrots and sticks approach, the school system itself is hemorrhaging students. We're starting to see charter schools come in, and they're really only operating in the city, in the boundaries of the city. So poor folks get the charter schools. Folks in the suburbs still enjoy their public schools. So that's one approach, is the kind of typical educational reform. What we need are higher standards. We need to test people on the standards, and then we need to hold people accountable. But it results in a lot of perverse outcomes. Chief among those is, seeing kids graduate who really haven't gotten the education that they deserve. They're just getting credentialed. Another way of looking at it is the outside game, which is sort of a non-governmental approach, which is to look at civic organizations to step in and provide additional resources. And that is happening, and the effects of that are wonderful. There are some organizations that have adopted a particular school, and they're using the school as a point of service. And so that model, I guess, suggests a possible way forward. And yet, I cannot help but think that we've adopted 2 schools and we've left 40 schools without somebody to come to the rescue. So how do you square that away? I mean, are we really going to just rely upon civil society and a voluntary type of arrangement? Charter schools and vouchers, again, that might be another the problem with the charter schools is that their outcomes are no better in terms of graduation rates, and that again, that they focus on testing and in particular areas, and so some of them, I guess the better of the charter schools, do see gains in math especially, but they do so by ignoring other aspects of education. And so the end result of that is that you have, in some cases, for the kids who can exercise the most self-control, is that you do see scores go up, but at the same time, you see a lot of other children become extremely disenchanted with the educational system because all they're getting is this kind of drilling for the test. You got to do well on the Regents exams to get your credit. That's what's going on for the high school students. For elementary school students, they literally will put the boards of the standardized test scores outside the door of the classroom. It's insane. And people know what's going on. And it's not, I think that it's interesting that I'm speaking now because there is this notion that with children especially, there should be this sense of play at work and nurturing them, and not this kind of high stakes and high anxiety inducing situations that we have right now. And not only that, it doesn't work. I mean, so I think that at the end, the problem is is and always has been poverty, and yet we still don't want to deal with it in the city of Rochester. We are in the place now where we're getting a new superintendent, and yet the mayor, who does not have any kind of direct control over the school district, is proposing a referendum on just completely replacing the school board, and that would also include the governor or the secretary of education appointing a new superintendent before the new superintendent we just got has even taken office. So I don't know if this guy has a job or not, and I don't even think he does. So it's a peculiar situation, and again, thinking that somehow we're going to fix things at the top and then that's going to trickle down is not worked in the past, and probably won't work in the future. So in any event, poverty undermines education because of its effects in terms of what we're talking about, stress and anxiety, and how that has an effect on the brain. And what happens is that these kids can, I just liken it to the fact that these kids are being chased by a giant grizzly bear. And we're trying to talk to them about the Industrial Revolution, or we're trying to talk to them about algebra. And their head is not in that game. Another metaphor that I like to draw on is that I feel like we show up as teachers, and the game that we want to play is baseball, and everybody shows up and they want to play lacrosse. There's a total disconnect. There's a huge disconnect as to what the activity of education actually is, and the kids have an agenda, and the adults have an agenda, and they're two different agendas. And as a consequence, the net result of that is kids who are having difficulty, and oftentimes it's just resulting in failure. So, I guess what I just want to say is that we need to reconceive education and not think of it in terms of education as the means to solve poverty, because it won't work that way. What we need to do is, we can't make education function in the presence of poverty. Education only works in its absence. And I think that this goes to a long tradition that we've had, going back to John Dewey at the very least, who said that we don't educate people directly, we create an environment that allows education to happen. And that train of thought continues on, and I've been particularly interested as of late in the works of Yuri Ronfenbrenner, who suggested that we need to look at education as a sort of ecological model, the bioecological model, and that we need to attend to every layer and level of the social world that the kids are operating in. And until we do that, this idea that we can encourage kids simply by establishing, quote, high standards and no excuses, and then that they are going to somehow rise to that challenge, will not work. It cannot work. They're not there. They don't show up to school every day to engage in that. There's a very small percentage of people who are willing to exercise that kind of amazing. And if you see a kid come out of poverty and who is dealing with institutionalized racism and all those others, and you see them actually grab the brass ring, they're the exception that proves the rule. They are not the exemplar that everyone else can use to move forward. So hopefully, moving forward in Rochester, I'm not sure exactly what will happen, but it's my hope that maybe we can bring some of the experiments that I've heard about over the weekend here, and maybe bring them to Rochester and add that to the mix in terms of our discussions as to how we are going to fix our educational system, because clearly what we're doing now isn't working.
There's some time for questions. We've been doing 3 at a time. I'd like to do that. I see Almaz. Who else would like to ask a question? Almaz, we'll let you start. Did I see you, Ari? Okay, so Almaz, Ari, and then who's behind Larry? Oh, floor. Okay, so we'll go in that order.
Thank you. Thanks. These are all great talks, and I think actually they do fit together very nicely. I have a question for Brent. Brent, to the extent that you've looked into the secondary literature on Thoreau, would you say that this is a story about him that is new, or is it? You suggested at the beginning some ways in which there are misperceptions about Thoreau on the question of self-reliance being equivalent or not equivalent to self-sufficiency, et cetera. Is this kind of a revisionist interpretation of Thoreau? I mean, I know he doesn't obviously direct basic income, very specifically, but is this something that is at odds with the way that he's seen by other interpreters?
Good question. There. So I think that
We're going to do all three.
Oh, sorry.
My
apologies.
That was me. I was getting
I actually have a little bit more of a global question. I agree with Almaz that to me these 4 presentations were so well aligned. And I guess the theme that I see throughout is how do you address the basic, one of the major objections to basic income, which is we'll all be idle. And I think in your respective ways, you address that, actually there's a lot of evidence that creative people will be creative and produce art. And, folks who are philosophers or, would actually spend their time being thoughtful and kind of introspective. And even on the education front, to me, the underlying theme that comes through is, we're trying to create a public education system that's training future workers, as opposed to really, in light of a basic income, could actually focus more on creating a civic society and a citizenry, right? So to me, that's the common theme, and I guess it speaks to the fact that you're all coming at this, coming at that central argument from these different perspectives. To me, belies the very fundamental problem of this discussion, which is that there's a cultural commitment to an idea that what we really should all be spending our time on is productive labor in the labor market. And I guess I'm wondering if you see hope through your various perspectives in moving that needle at all.
Question to Elliot. Love the capabilities response. And sincere question, have you field tested this? Any stories about that? Okay. I mean, I've tried a little bit, but anyway, it would be really great to do that.
For your students, we'll let you start.
Sure. Okay. So the clearing up of the 2 misconceptions with which I started my presentation. The opinions that I expressed there, I think, are representative of the Thoreau studies community. The people who read Thoreau carefully and understand him well would probably mostly agree with what I said there. These misconceptions are popular misconceptions. So it's not. I'm not taking a side in a live scholarly debate. Did that answer the question? Was that more to it?
Interpreting him as being supportive of a kind of a genius grant.
Oh, yes. Okay. So as far as the rest of it goes, that's an original thesis, and I'm going to be giving a version of this talk in a month's time at a Thoreau Studies conference, and I think that that part of it will be thinking about Thoreau in a new way for many people.
Just quickly, in terms of your comment about the common thread that sort of goes through all of this, is, again, I think Urie Bronfenbrenner had his last book is called Making Humans Human. Just lost the microphone. So, okay, wow. Okay, so that's that's the thing. I mean, it's can we have just it is the abundance mindset that you're talking about. It is the kind of genius, and I couldn't help but think of Nietzsche when you're talking about what's going, about Thoreau's attitude about the genius, because, and exactly what you said is that Emerson said the genius expresses what we all already know. So, I mean, there's a great intellectual genealogy to draw upon for universal basic income. And again, going to Ellie's book, because we were talking about this last night, is why doesn't that seem to gain more traction?
So thank you for that question about have I tested capabilities. I gave a very simple no, and I'm going to give a more sophisticated no. So I think as you see how, so I personally, by no, I personally haven't, overseen or been involved with any pilot project studies. I'm really interested to kind of like somehow get some sort of foothold in the potential BC. I'm from British Columbia, and sort of seeing about what's going to happen there and seeing if there's any, that's just kind of a pie in the sky, maybe hope for me, but so I think though, as a lot of pilot projects have moved kind of beyond just testing workforce participation like the earlier ones have done, they've kind of done something like looking at capabilities. And so I think I think there is a lot of the results from these pilot projects can be understood within the framework of capability. So like the Basic Income Canada Network signpost to success. A lot of that you could take and say, hey, look, this is capability promoting behavior that exists. So I think that you can sort of do like a retrodictive analysis in terms of saying, okay, here's what we can sort of draw out from things that have already been done. But I think it also provides a good way of framing how do we move beyond, say, just testing mere GDP. What kinds of research questions are we going to ask in pilot projects? I think the capability model can provide that sort of provide a framework for that for a more expansive kind of view. I think to the question about sort of how do we kind of move beyond this idea that merely to kind of that sort of to make a contribution or productive activities merely to engage in paid employment. I think I'm really interested in the genealogy of that. So I think kind of most of my work has been in the history of really modern philosophy, and you have this kind of shift in a way where you start to measure work not so much as kind of within a person or in a product. That's kind of how the medievals tend to think of work, but rather as this sort of thing that we can measure, this kind of process that's measurable that comes into full fruition with the labor theory of value. And I think that's kind of just become deeply culturally entrenched. So we have a hard time thinking about something productive as anything if we can't really measure it. But I think that we are kind of at an interesting historical point in terms of seeing a kind of disruptive shift. Whether there will be kind of more jobs, whether there will be fewer jobs, it's hard to say. But I think given this kind of moment, people I think are interested in thinking about this question, what is work and what does it mean to engage in a productive activity? And so I'd want to use that space to say, yeah, hey, engaging, doing art, care work, these are all things that make a valuable, productive contribution. But I think, so I don't know how hopeful I am that will happen, but I think that we're at a historical moment where it can happen.
So going back to that question about the criticism of UBI as it would make people lazy. Obviously, if you look at artists, that wouldn't be the case. So that's a pretty easy criticism to prove if you look at artists. But as I mentioned, there is this cultural acceptance that you can exploit people with passion. So that's what you have to be careful about, I think. If we implement UBI, then people might think, hey, they're getting UBI, so we can even exploit them more. I mean, they wouldn't really be thinking about that consciously, but because it's so ingrained, I'm not really sure what we can do to shift that. I mean, American culture is just so much about winners take all, especially in the arts. Film stars, musicians, all these, we love superstars. Whereas in real life, I mean, you being a teacher, you know how important creativity and art is, in children's development. We know it. It's everywhere in life, but somehow it just doesn't translate to the real world. So I don't know, I think it's a big challenge that we need to acknowledge.
We're at time. I'm going to allow one question, and then I think we'll close it down. I know that I want to respect the schedule. So please, one question, and then folks can respond, and then I'll let people take a break.
Yeah, one small comment and then a question. Forget your name, the young lady. I think people exploit others because of the circumstances they are in, and not because. So if UBI is there, then their circumstance improves, and the others who are exploitative anyway, everybody wants to spend the least for whatever he or she is getting. So they can still survive, and then they would not be really allow others to exploit them. So UBI is not going to add to the exploitation. If anything, it will decrease exploitation. The other thing I wanted to find out from you, again, the names, please forgive me. When you mentioned about this dominance and reciprocity, I couldn't relate the two together. If you could please explain to me. I had something else, but I think we better get time. Go ahead.
Well, I don't have an answer to that. You know, obviously, artists would love UBI. There's no question about that. So, but how that would translate in terms of how other people would treat artists, for me, there's no way of me knowing that.
Can I introduce myself? We're talking about artists, and that's what I am. My whole life has been struggling within the social confines of poverty. My mom, when she got divorced, was moved on her job transfer to Winnipeg, and she basically raised me in poverty on social assistance. I am that rare case where you say somebody can be strong enough to pull out. I legally never passed a grade. So grade 6 was the last legal grade I passed. I had to climb my way out of the hole. I'm still in that hole. Right now I'm going to school studying to try to be a peer support specialist while living in my van when I'm in Toronto. Here, every night I've had to find a different place. I didn't find a place till 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning this morning, so on and so forth. So but I've had the perseverance and the belief in my work and my skills that I can make it. And I'm a voice for all the voices of people whose education usually will plateau at grade 6 or whatever it is they're allowed to go. In Toronto, they're allowed to ride the system till they're 12, so they can at least get 6 years of education. After that, if there's no way of getting to school, they're not likely going to get much further than that. And that's very deplorable and very depressing. But I got involved with this because my whole adult life, from the time I started writing poetry and songs, my ambitions and passions, I have needed this UBI system. Because it's not that I'm not working or not trying to get ahead or do well for myself, it's just that there's no category, there's no coverage for people in my group, in my category. Like, I hope to still be able to graduate from university, even if it takes until I'm 50, and complete something that people would say as a child I wouldn't have a chance to have had because of the deplorable state that I was raised and lived in and the neglect that I was having to survive and persevere from. So I realized I have to cross the two, the art with my passion for UBI. I started with being voted in through the committee that I was a part of, the Ontario Basic Income Network, which is now sort of broken apart since the pilot got cut. But I'm still going to keep doing what I'm doing, and I make posters.
Okay, real quick, and I want to let you know, we've got 2 of those here. I want folks to take a look.
And I would have said, if anybody wants one for themselves, they can come and ask me, and then I can give information.
What's your name? So we can
Jennifer Cooley, sorry. If you want to get a hold of me, you can reach Sheila. She's got my contact information as well, or come talk to me, and then I can explain more what I'd like to see happen between our 2 countries.
I want to dissolve the panel. We're going to let you all go have a break. Jennifer, thank you. And I left your posters up here so folks could look. I know you have a couple more. Thank you all very much. Say thank you to this panel.